Miners disappeared in 1951. 53 years have passed, and investigators discover a horrifying secret. The soil sample should have been ordinary, just another routine test in the endless paperwork of environmental science. But when Dr. Sarah Chen held the small glass vial up to the autumn sunlight, filtering through the Appalachian fog, she knew something was terribly wrong. The dirt wasn't just dirt. It was telling a story that had been buried for 53 years. September 2004. Copper Ridge, West Virginia. Population 847. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets should be impossible to keep. Sarah had arrived 3 weeks earlier with her geological survey team, expecting nothing more challenging than analyzing soil composition for a proposed shopping center. The mountain air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the distant aroma of wood smoke from chimneys already working against the early fall chill. The town welcomed them with the careful politeness of people who've learned to be wary of outsiders. Mayor Robert Franklin, a man whose handshake was firm but whose eyes never quite met yours directly, had personally escorted Sarah's team to their designated sites. Just routine environmental stuff, he'd assured the curious locals who gathered at Miller's General Store each morning, their coffee cups steaming in the mountain air. Nothing to worry about. But Sarah worried. It was her nature, the methodical mind that had earned her a Ph.D. from Stanford and a reputation for uncovering environmental hazards that others missed. As the daughter of immigrants who'd fought to be heard in a country that often ignored them, she'd learned early that the truth was usually hiding just beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to dig. The first 3 weeks had been routine. Soil samples from the proposed development site came back normal. pH levels, mineral content, contamination markers, all within expected ranges. Sarah had begun drafting her preliminary report, already thinking about her next assignment, when Marcus Torres, her research partner, made the discovery that would change everything. "Sarah, you need to see this." His voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. Marcus was unflappable. 15 years of geological surveys had shown him everything from toxic waste dumps to prehistoric fossils. Nothing surprised him anymore, until now. The sample came from grid section C7, just 50 yards from where the new shopping center's anchor store was planned. Under the microscope, the soil revealed mineral compositions that defied explanation. Elements that shouldn't exist in this part of West Virginia. Rare earth metals that suggested mining operations far more sophisticated than the simple coal extraction this region was known for. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah whispered, adjusting the microscope's focus. The autumn wind rattled the windows of their temporary laboratory, set up in the basement of the old community center. Outside, the mountains kept their secrets beneath a blanket of morning mist. But what they found in that soil sample was just the beginning. Because in a town like Copper Ridge, where the past is carefully preserved in sepia photographs and sanitized stories, some secrets run deeper than any mine shaft ever dug. The Copper Ridge Public Library smelled of old paper and forgotten dreams. Sarah pushed through the heavy oak doors, the brass hinges creaking a warning that echoed through the silent stacks. She needed answers, and in small towns, librarians were often the keepers of inconvenient truths. Dorothy Mills looked up from her desk, her silver hair catching the pale morning light that filtered through dust-covered windows. At 73, she'd been the town's librarian for nearly 5 decades, arriving just 2 years after the miners disappeared. Her eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, studied Sarah with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting a long time for the right questions to be asked. "You're the scientist," Dorothy said. Not a question, but a statement heavy with meaning. "The one asking about soil samples." Sarah nodded, pulling out a folder containing the anomalous test results. "Mrs. Mills, I was hoping you might help me understand the mining history here. These readings suggest operations far more complex than simple coal extraction." Dorothy's weathered hands stilled on the book she'd been cataloging. A collection of Appalachian folklore, its pages yellowed with age, The silence stretched between them, filled only by the tick of the ancient grandfather clock in the corner and the distant sound of wind moving through the mountain pines outside. "Some stories," Dorothy finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "aren't meant to be told. But sometimes they demand to be heard anyway." She stood slowly, her joints protesting with age, and walked to a section of the library Sarah hadn't noticed before. Hidden behind the genealogy records was a small, locked cabinet. Dorothy produced an old brass key from her sweater pocket, one she'd clearly carried for years. "My grandmother, Esther Mills, she worked at the mining office in 1951, secretary to the operations manager." The lock clicked open, and Dorothy withdrew a manila envelope, its edges soft with handling. "She made me promise to keep this safe. Said someday someone would come asking the right questions." Inside the envelope were photographs, black and white images that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Men in government uniforms standing beside mining equipment she'd never seen before. Trucks with no license plates hauling machinery that looked more scientific than industrial. And in the background of every photo, the same group of 12 miners, their faces etched with a wariness that spoke of secrets they'd been sworn to keep. "Operation Deep Strike," Dorothy read from a document at the bottom of the envelope. "That's what they called it. My grandmother said they weren't just mining coal. They were looking for something else, something the government needed badly enough to pay every family in town to keep quiet." Sarah's hands trembled as she examined the photographs more closely. The equipment was decades ahead of anything that should have existed in rural West Virginia in 1951. Electromagnetic sensors, core sampling devices that wouldn't become standard until the 1970s, and most disturbing of all, men in what appeared to be radiation suits. "What happened to them?" Sarah asked, though she already feared the answer. Dorothy's eyes filled with unshed tears. One day they were here. The next morning, gone. All 12 families. The official story was they'd gotten better jobs in Detroit. But my grandmother knew better. She tried to organize search parties, but Mayor Franklin, this Franklin's grandfather, told everyone to mind their own business. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the library floor. Sarah realized she'd been holding her breath. The photographs told a story of a mining operation that was far more than it appeared, and the implications made her scientific mind reel. "There's more," Dorothy whispered, glancing toward the windows as if afraid someone might be watching. "My grandmother left detailed notes, maps of the tunnels that don't appear on any official survey, and something else, recordings she made secretly of the government men's conversations." The reel-to-reel tape recorder looked ancient even by 1951 standards, but Dorothy handled it with the reverence of someone protecting a sacred relic. Sarah watched as the elderly librarian threaded the fragile tape through the mechanism, her fingers steady despite her age. "My grandmother was clever," Dorothy explained, adjusting the volume knob. "She hid this recorder in the supply closet next to the mining office. Every time those government men had their meetings, she'd turn it on." The tape crackled to life, filling the library's silence with voices from the past. Static and age had degraded the quality, but the words were still clear enough to make Sarah's blood run cold. "Operation is proceeding ahead of schedule. The rare earth deposits are more extensive than our preliminary surveys indicated. Need to maintain absolute secrecy. If word gets out about the uranium traces, every prospector in 3 states will be crawling over these mountains." "What about the miners? Some of them are asking questions about the equipment." "They're being well compensated for their discretion. Money has a way of ensuring loyalty." Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding. Uranium. In 1951, just 6 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, uranium was more valuable than gold, and infinitely more dangerous. The implications of a secret government mining operation in West Virginia during the height of Cold War paranoia were staggering. "There's more," Dorothy said, fast-forwarding the tape. This is from 3 weeks before they all disappeared. The voices that emerged were tenser, filled with an urgency that hadn't been present in the earlier recordings. Situation is becoming untenable. The miners are talking about the readings they're getting from the lower tunnels. Radiation exposure is within acceptable parameters. Acceptable for who? These men have families, children. If they find out what they've really been mining, they won't find out. The operation concludes in 6 weeks. We extract what we need and seal the tunnels permanently. And the miners? The pause that followed was so long, Sarah thought the tape had stopped. When the voice resumed, it was barely audible. They know too much. Alternative arrangements are being made. Dorothy stopped the tape, her face pale in the fading afternoon light. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, casting deep shadows across the valley. The wind had picked up, rattling the library windows like fingers trying to get inside. Alternative arrangements, Sarah repeated, the phrase tasting bitter in her mouth. What did that mean? My grandmother never found out, Dorothy replied, but she suspected. The day before the miners disappeared, she saw trucks from the State Highway Department blocking all the mountain roads. Official reason was emergency repair work, but the repairs never happened. Sarah studied the photographs again, this time noticing details that had escaped her before. The government men wore no identifying badges or insignia. Their vehicles had been carefully scrubbed of any markings. Even their faces seemed deliberately obscured by shadows or angles that made identification difficult. It was a cover-up from the beginning, she realized aloud. They never intended for those miners to leave alive. Dorothy nodded grimly. My grandmother tried to warn them. She went to Thomas Henley. He was the crew foreman, the night before they vanished. Told him she'd overheard things that made her worry for their safety. He laughed, said the government was paying them more than they'd ever made, said they were patriots doing important work for their country. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. These men had believed they were serving their nation, never realizing they were being set up as expendable assets in a Cold War operation that valued secrecy over human life. But as she studied the final photograph in the collection, Sarah noticed something that made her hands shake. In the background, partially hidden behind a mining truck, stood a young man she hadn't seen before. Unlike the others, his expression wasn't one of pride or determination. It was terror. And written on the back of the photograph, in faded ink, were 3 words that would change everything. Jimmy Franklin survived. Thunder rolled across Copper Ridge as Sarah drove through the narrow streets toward Mayor Franklin's office. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke, sending sheets of rain against her windshield and turning the mountain roads treacherous. But the weather was nothing compared to the storm brewing in her mind. Jimmy Franklin survived. The words echoed with each lightning flash. If the current mayor's grandfather had a brother who lived through whatever happened in those tunnels, then Robert Franklin knew far more than he was letting on. The mayor's office occupied the ground floor of the old courthouse, a building that had presided over Copper Ridge since 1923. Sarah parked under the single streetlight that still worked and ran through the downpour, her folder of evidence clutched against her chest. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over dated wood paneling and faded carpeting. Mayor Franklin looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression shifting from surprise to something that looked almost like fear when he saw her rain-soaked appearance and determined expression. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "what brings you out on such a terrible night?" Sarah placed the photograph on his desk, the one showing Jimmy Franklin in the background, terror etched on his young face. She watched as recognition flickered in the mayor's eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like resignation. "We need to talk about your family's history with Operation Deep Strike," she said quietly. The color drained from Franklin's face. For a long moment, the only sounds were the rain against the windows and the steady tick of the antique clock on the wall. Finally, he reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a bottle of bourbon, pouring himself a generous measure with shaking hands. I've been waiting 53 years for someone to ask me that question, he said, his political composure cracking. My grandfather swore me to secrecy on his deathbed, but I've carried this burden my entire life. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the storm-lashed mountains. Lightning illuminated the peaks in stark black and white, like the photographs Sarah had discovered in the library. Jimmy was my grandfather's younger brother. 22 years old, fresh out of the army, thought he'd found the perfect job. Good pay, steady work, serving his country. He had no idea what he was really signing up for. Sarah leaned forward, her notebook ready. What happened to him? Franklin turned back to her, his eyes haunted. He managed to get out of the tunnels the night of the collapse. Came to my grandfather's house, bleeding, radiation sick, barely able to speak. Said the government men had set off explosives, sealed the other miners inside. Said he only escaped because he'd been working a different section that night. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. They weren't just missing, they were murdered. Jimmy lived for 3 more weeks, Franklin continued, his voice breaking. My grandfather hid him in the root cellar, tried to nurse him back to health. But the radiation exposure was too severe. He died in agony, begging my grandfather to tell the world what really happened. But your grandfather never did. Franklin laughed bitterly. The government men made sure of that. They came to the house 2 days after Jimmy died, offered my grandfather a choice: accept a substantial payment for his silence, or face charges for harboring a fugitive from a classified operation. They had papers, official documents that branded Jimmy a security risk who'd stolen government property. Sarah felt sick. The systematic nature of the cover-up was staggering. Not only had they murdered 11 miners, but they'd ensured that even the families of survivors would remain silent through a combination of bribery and threats. The money they gave your grandfather built half this town, Franklin admitted. The new school, the community center, the road improvements that brought in the tourism industry. Everything good about Copper Ridge was paid for with blood money. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak. Lightning strikes came one after another, illuminating the mountains in stuttering glimpses. Sarah thought about the families who'd never known the truth about their loved ones, who'd spent decades believing their fathers and husbands had simply abandoned them for better opportunities. There's something else, Franklin said, opening a filing cabinet and withdrawing a manila envelope similar to the one Dorothy had shown her. Jimmy didn't just tell my grandfather what happened. He brought proof. Inside the envelope were documents that made Sarah's hands shake. Official government correspondence detailing the uranium extraction operation. Orders to terminate local assets once the mission was complete. And most damning of all, a list of names. Not just the miners, but other witnesses who were to be handled if they became a problem. Dorothy Mills's grandmother was on that list. Dawn broke gray and cold over Copper Ridge, the storm having left the mountains shrouded in mist that clung to the valleys like guilty secrets. Sarah hadn't slept. She'd spent the night in her hotel room, poring over the documents Mayor Franklin had given her, trying to piece together the full scope of the government's operation. Marcus found her in the hotel coffee shop, her table covered with maps, photographs, and photocopied documents. His usual skeptical demeanor had been replaced by something Sarah had rarely seen in her research partner: genuine fear. "I've been running electromagnetic scans all night," he said, sliding into the booth across from her. "Sarah, there's something down there. Something big. The readings suggest a complex network of tunnels that extends far beyond what any of the official mining surveys show." Sarah looked up from the map. She'd been studying one of the hand-drawn tunnel layouts Dorothy's grandmother had hidden for over 50 years. "How big?" "We're talking about a facility that would rival some of the government's major research installations. Multiple levels, interconnected chambers, and something else." Marcus paused, his scientific composure cracking. "There are still active power sources down there. After 53 years, something is still running." The implications sent a chill down Sarah's spine. If the tunnels were still powered, it meant the operation had never truly ended. Someone had been maintaining whatever the government had built beneath Copper Ridge. "We need to get down there," she said, though every instinct screamed against it. Marcus nodded grimly. "I found what I think is the main entrance. It's about 2 miles up the old logging road, hidden behind a rock fall that looks natural but shows clear signs of controlled demolition. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make it look like a cave-in." An hour later, they were hiking through dense forest, their breath visible in the cold morning air. The path Marcus had discovered was barely visible, overgrown with 5 decades of vegetation. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah began to notice signs that chilled her blood. Warning signs, faded and weathered, but still legible. "Danger, authorized personnel only," and "radioactive materials, no entry." Most disturbing of all were the newer signs, their paint fresh and official. "Federal property. Trespassers will be prosecuted." "Someone's been maintaining these signs," Sarah observed, running her finger over the crisp lettering. "This isn't an abandoned site." They reached the rock fall as the morning mist began to lift. What Marcus had called a controlled demolition was obvious once you knew what to look for. The boulders were too uniform, too precisely placed to be natural. And between them, partially hidden by brush and debris, was a gap just large enough for a person to squeeze through. "This is insane," Marcus muttered, but he was already pulling on his protective gear. "If there's still radiation down there, then we find out what they've been hiding for 53 years, Sarah finished, checking her own equipment. The Geiger counter she'd borrowed from the university was military grade, designed for exactly this kind of dangerous investigation. The tunnel beyond the rockfall was unlike anything Sarah had expected. Instead of the rough-hewn walls of a traditional mine, they found themselves in a corridor that was clearly engineered. Concrete walls, steel support beams, and most unnerving of all, electric lights that flickered to life as they moved deeper underground. "Motion sensors," Marcus breathed. "This place is still active." The Geiger counter clicked steadily, but not alarmingly as they descended. Whatever radioactive materials had been mined here were either contained or had decayed to safer levels. But as they moved deeper, they began to find evidence of the operation's true scope. Laboratory equipment, rooms lined with lead shielding, and in one chamber, a sight that made Sarah's blood run cold. Personal belongings, work clothes, lunch boxes, family photographs, all belonging to the missing miners, arranged as if they'd simply stepped away for a moment. But it was the final room that revealed the full horror of what had happened in these tunnels. On the walls were detailed mining charts showing not just uranium deposits, but extraction schedules, shipment dates, and most damning of all, a timeline labeled Asset Termination. The miners hadn't just been murdered. They'd been systematically eliminated according to a predetermined schedule, their deaths planned from the moment they'd been hired. And at the bottom of the timeline, in neat bureaucratic handwriting, was a note that made Sarah's hands shake. Phase 2. Personnel to be recruited from local population as needed for ongoing operations. The man sitting in the shadows of the abandoned gas station looked like a ghost. 74 years old, with white hair that hadn't been cut in months, and eyes that held the haunted stare of someone who'd seen too much. Sarah almost didn't recognize him from the faded photograph Dorothy had shown her, but there was no mistaking the scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. A souvenir from his escape from the tunnels 53 years ago. Danny Henley, son of Foreman Thomas Henley, was supposed to be dead. "I heard you've been asking questions," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Figured it was time someone who was there told you what really happened." Sarah's heart pounded as she sat across from him at the rusty metal table. Marcus had stayed back at their equipment, monitoring the area for any sign they were being watched. After their discovery in the tunnels, They knew they were no longer dealing with a simple historical mystery. "Everyone thinks I died in Detroit in 1967, Danny continued, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "Drug overdose, they said. Convenient story. Truth is, I've been living in these mountains ever since I crawled out of that hellhole, staying hidden, staying alive." "Why didn't you come forward?" Sarah asked gently. "You could have exposed what they did." Danny laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off the station's broken windows. "You think I didn't try? I went to the FBI in 1952. They thanked me for my service and told me the matter was classified. I went to newspapers. Suddenly, those reporters got reassigned or found better jobs in other states. I tried to contact the families of the other miners, but every letter I sent came back marked, 'Address unknown.'" The systematic nature of the cover-up was becoming clearer. The government hadn't just murdered the miners. They'd orchestrated a complete erasure of their existence, making it impossible for anyone to piece together the truth. "Tell me about that night," Sarah said, her recorder running. "What really happened in the tunnels?" Danny's eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing ghosts from half a century past. "We'd been working different shifts for weeks. The government men said it was for security. But I think now they were keeping us separated so we couldn't compare notes about what we were really mining." He took a long drag from his cigarette before continuing. "I was working the third level that night, running samples up to the surface lab. That's when I heard the explosions. Not one or two, a whole series of them, like they were sealing multiple sections simultaneously." Sarah felt sick. "They trapped them, deliberately." "Worse than that," Danny said, his voice breaking. "I found my father and 3 other men in Section B. They weren't killed by the explosion. They were dying slow from radiation poisoning. The government had been exposing us to lethal doses for weeks, and they knew it. The explosions were just to make sure none of us could get medical help in time." The cruelty of it was staggering. Not content with simply murdering the miners, the government had subjected them to weeks of deliberate radiation exposure, watching them slowly sicken while maintaining the pretense that they were valued employees. "My father lived for 6 hours after I found him," Danny continued, tears streaming down his weathered face. "He made me promise 2 things: get out alive and never let them forget what happened here. I've kept both promises, even if staying alive meant everyone thinking I was dead." Sarah leaned forward. "Danny, we found evidence that the operation never ended. There are still people working in those tunnels." His face hardened. "I know. I've been watching for 53 years. Every few months they bring in new people. Local kids, mostly. Kids who need money, who won't be missed if something goes wrong. Same pattern as 1951, just smaller scale." The horror of it hit Sarah like a physical blow. The government had been running continuous operations for over half a century, slowly murdering locals and covering it up with the same methods they'd perfected in 1951. "Who's running it now?" she asked. Danny stubbed out his cigarette and looked directly at her for the first time. Some of the same families that helped cover it up the first time. People whose grandparents took government money to stay quiet. They're in too deep to stop now. Martha Whitfield, Sarah realized aloud, the mayor's secretary, who'd been so helpful in providing information about the missing families. Among others, Danny confirmed, she's been recruiting for them since the 1970s. Always young people with no strong family ties, people who wouldn't be missed. She tells them it's archaeological work or environmental testing. By the time they realize what they're really doing, it's too late. Martha Whitfield's house sat at the end of a quiet street, its white picket fence and flower garden the picture of small-town innocence. But as Sarah approached the front door that evening, she couldn't shake the image of Danny Henley's haunted eyes or his words about the secretary who'd been recruiting victims for 5 decades. The door opened before Sarah could knock. Martha stood in the doorway, her elderly frame silhouetted against the warm light from inside. Her usual friendly smile was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a cold calculation that made Sarah's blood run cold. Dr. Sarah Chen, Martha said, her voice devoid of the grandmotherly warmth she'd displayed during their previous meetings. I've been expecting you. Inside, the house was a museum of Copper Ridge history. Photographs lined the mantelpiece showing the town's evolution over the decades. But now Sarah noticed what she'd missed before. In many of the photos, young people appeared and then vanished from subsequent pictures, as if they'd simply ceased to exist. You've been very thorough in your investigation, Martha said, settling into her rocking chair with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. Perhaps too thorough for your own good? Sarah remained standing, every instinct telling her to run. But she needed answers, and Martha was clearly ready to provide them. How many? She asked simply. How many what, dear? Martha's tone was mocking now. The facade of helplessness completely dropped. How many people have you helped murder over the years? Martha smiled, a cold, reptilian expression that transformed her face into something inhuman. You make it sound so dramatic. I prefer to think of it as serving my country, just like my grandfather did when he helped cover up the original operation. The family connection hit Sarah like a revelation. Martha wasn't just a government asset. She was part of a multi-generational conspiracy that had been protecting Operation Deep Strike since its inception. The original miners weren't the first, Martha continued, rocking gently in her chair as if discussing the weather. My grandfather told me stories about earlier experiments, Native American tribes who disappeared in the 1920s, migrant workers in the 1930s. The government has been using these mountains as a testing ground for decades. Sarah felt sick. Testing ground for what? Radiation exposure studies initially, then biological weapons research, chemical warfare agents. The tunnels you found are just one small part of a much larger network. There are facilities under these mountains that would make your scientific mind reel with their sophistication. The scope of it was staggering. What Sarah had thought was a single tragic incident was actually part of a century-long program of human experimentation and murder, all hidden beneath the innocuous facade of a small Appalachian town. The current operation focuses primarily on genetic research, Martha continued, clearly enjoying Sarah's horror. We provide test subjects, and the researchers provide funding that keeps this town alive. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. Test subjects, Sarah repeated, bile rising in her throat. You mean victims? I mean volunteers who serve a greater purpose, Martha corrected sharply. Young people with no families, no prospects, no one who would miss them. We give their lives meaning. Sarah thought about the personal belongings she'd found in the tunnels, the family photographs and lunchboxes that suggested people who'd simply vanished mid-life. These weren't volunteers. They were human beings who'd been systematically hunted and murdered. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked. Martha's smile widened. Because you're going to join them, of course. Your investigation has made you a liability, but your scientific background makes you valuable. The researchers are always interested in subjects with advanced education. The trap snapped shut around Sarah as she realized the true situation. Her investigation hadn't gone unnoticed. It had been monitored and controlled from the beginning. Martha had been feeding her information, guiding her discoveries, leading her deeper into the conspiracy until she'd learned too much to be allowed to leave. Marcus? Sarah asked, fearing the answer. Your partner is already in the tunnels, Martha said calmly. He went back to collect more readings and never returned. Unfortunate, but these things happen around dangerous mining sites. Sarah's hand moved toward her cell phone, but Martha shook her head. Cell service has been disabled in this area since this morning. And I'm afraid your rental car developed engine trouble while you've been visiting. You'll find it won't start. The systematic nature of the trap revealed itself. Sarah had been isolated, cut off from any means of escape or communication. Martha had orchestrated her capture with the same cold efficiency that had been eliminating people for decades. The basement beneath Martha's house was nothing like the cozy root cellar Sarah had expected. Steel walls, fluorescent lighting, and the antiseptic smell of a medical facility greeted her as two men in hazmat suits forced her down the stairs. Her hands were zip-tied behind her back, but her mind raced with possibilities for escape. "Welcome to Processing Station Alpha," one of the men said, his voice muffled by his protective mask. "You'll be transferred to the main facility shortly." Through a reinforced window, Sarah could see into an adjacent room where Marcus sat strapped to a medical examination table, electrodes attached to his head and chest. His eyes were open but vacant, and Sarah realized with horror that they'd already begun whatever twisted experiments they conducted on their victims. "The neural mapping process is quite fascinating," Martha said, joining them in the observation room. She'd changed from her grandmother clothes into a crisp white lab coat that made her transformation from kindly secretary to cold-blooded monster complete. "We can extract memories, implant suggestions, even completely rewrite personality structures. Your partner is helping us understand how geological knowledge is processed in the human brain." Sarah fought against her restraints, rage overriding fear. "You're torturing him." "We're advancing human knowledge," Martha corrected. "The data we collect here contributes to projects that will benefit all mankind. Individual sacrifice for the greater good." The justification was the same one used by every monster in history, Sarah realized. The belief that their victims were somehow expendable in service of a greater cause. But as she watched Marcus twitch helplessly on the examination table, she knew there was no greater good that could justify this horror. "The original miners were just the beginning," Martha continued, clearly proud of her role in the decades-long operation. "We've processed over 300 subjects since 1951. Each one has contributed valuable data to our understanding of human physiology, psychology, and genetic structures. 300 people. 300 lives destroyed in service of Martha's twisted vision of scientific progress." Sarah thought about the families who'd never known what happened to their missing loved ones, the communities that had been slowly hollowed out by systematic murder. "What happened to their bodies?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Martha gestured to another window, this one looking down into a much larger chamber. Sarah's stomach turned as she saw what appeared to be an industrial crematorium, its flames still glowing behind reinforced glass. "Complete disposal is essential for maintaining operational security. No evidence, no investigations." The casual way Martha discussed mass murder was perhaps more disturbing than the crimes themselves. This wasn't the behavior of someone who'd been corrupted over time. This was someone who'd been born without fundamental human empathy, who saw other people as nothing more than raw materials for her experiments. A klaxon began blaring and red lights flashed throughout the facility. Martha frowned, checking a communication device on her belt. "What's happening?" one of the technicians asked. "Security breach in Tunnel Section D," Martha replied, her composure slipping for the first time. "Someone's interfered with the primary containment systems." Through the chaos of alarms and flashing lights, Sarah heard something that gave her hope. Danny Henley's voice coming through the facility's intercom system. "This is for my father and the 11 other men you murdered in 1951, his voice echoed through the underground complex. "And for all the people you've killed since then. The truth ends tonight." Martha's face went white. "That's impossible. Daniel Henley died decades ago." "Apparently not," Sarah said, unable to keep the satisfaction out of her voice despite her desperate situation. The lights in the facility flickered and went out, replaced by dim emergency lighting that cast eerie red shadows across the laboratory. In the darkness, Sarah could hear sounds of struggle, shouts of confusion, and most importantly, the sound of someone systematically destroying the equipment that had been used to torture and murder hundreds of innocent people. The explosion that rocked the underground facility threw everyone to the ground. Sarah felt her chair topple backward, her head striking the concrete floor as emergency klaxons wailed and dust rained from the ceiling. In the chaos, she saw Martha scramble for a communication panel, her composed facade finally cracking. "All units to Section D immediately," Martha screamed into the microphone. "We have a hostile infiltration." But the facility's response was disorganized, panicked. After decades of operating in complete secrecy, they'd never prepared for a direct assault. Danny Henley had used their arrogance against them, striking at the moment when they felt most secure. Through the reinforced window, Sarah could see Marcus beginning to stir on the examination table. Whatever drugs they'd given him were wearing off, and his eyes were starting to focus. He caught sight of Sarah and mouthed words she couldn't hear through the glass. But his meaning was clear. He was alive, and he was fighting the effects of whatever they'd done to him. Another explosion shook the facility, closer this time. The lights flickered again, and Sarah heard something that filled her with hope. The sound of steel doors being blown open. Danny wasn't just destroying equipment. He was systematically opening every locked section of the complex. "How is this possible?" one of the technicians asked, his voice high with panic. "How does he know the facility layout?" Martha's face had gone ashen. "He's been watching us for 50 years, mapping our operations, learning our schedules, preparing for this." The scope of Danny's patience was staggering. While everyone believed him dead, he'd been conducting his own investigation, gathering intelligence on the people who'd murdered his father and hundreds of others. Tonight wasn't random violence. It was the culmination of decades of meticulous planning. The facility's main power cut out completely, leaving only battery-powered emergency lighting. In the dim red glow, Sarah saw her chance. The technician guarding her had moved to help Martha with the communication systems, leaving her momentarily unobserved. Despite her zip-tied hands, Sarah managed to work the plastic restraints against the sharp edge of her overturned chair. The guards were focused on the wider crisis, and the emergency lighting created pockets of shadow where she could work without being seen. The sound of gunfire echoed through the corridors, followed by screams. Danny wasn't just destroying equipment. He was eliminating the people who'd perpetuated this horror. The knowledge that he was killing her captors should have disturbed Sarah, but after witnessing the systematic murder of hundreds of innocent people, she felt only grim satisfaction. "Security teams aren't responding," one of the technicians reported, his voice shaking. "I think he's taken out the entire night shift." "Impossible," Martha hissed. "He's one old man." "He's an old man with nothing left to lose," Sarah said, finally freeing her hands from the restraints. "And 53 years to plan his revenge." Martha spun around, realizing too late that Sarah had escaped. But instead of running, Sarah did something that caught everyone off guard. She charged directly at the control panel that operated the examination room where Marcus was held. Her years of studying complex scientific equipment served her well as she quickly identified the locks and restraint controls. With Martha and the technicians still reacting to her sudden movement, Sarah managed to release Marcus's restraints and open the door between the chambers. "Sarah!" Marcus called out, his voice weak but determined. "The whole facility, it's not just a laboratory. It's a dumping ground. I saw the records while they had me connected to their machines. They've been disposing of evidence from government black sites across the country for decades." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Copper Ridge wasn't just a local horror. It was part of a national network of government facilities where inconvenient people disappeared forever. The scale of the conspiracy was beyond anything she'd imagined. Another explosion, much closer now, sent cracks spreading across the reinforced windows. Through the spider-webbed glass, Sarah could see fires burning in the lower levels of the facility. Danny was systematically destroying everything, ensuring that no evidence of the experiments could be salvaged. "The data!" Martha screamed, frantically trying to access computer terminals that were failing one by one. "Albert, 50 years of research data." "Good," Sarah said simply. "Some knowledge is too dangerous to exist." The smoke was getting thicker, and the temperature in the facility was rising rapidly. Sarah helped Marcus to his feet, supporting his weight as they navigated through corridors filled with panicking technicians and the acrid smell of burning chemicals. Behind them, Martha's voice had become increasingly desperate as she tried to coordinate an evacuation while preserving her precious research data. "Leave it!" one of her remaining technicians shouted. "The whole place is going to collapse." But Martha couldn't let go. As Sarah and Marcus reached the main corridor, they could see her frantically downloading files onto portable drives, unwilling to abandon decades of evidence that could implicate her in hundreds of murders. "This way," Marcus said, pointing toward an exit sign barely visible through the smoke. "I memorized the layout while they had me connected to their machines." As they moved through the facility, Sarah saw the full scope of what Danny had accomplished. Every laboratory was destroyed, every computer terminal smashed, every piece of equipment that could be used to continue the experiments reduced to twisted metal and shattered glass. But more than that, he'd exposed filing cabinets filled with documents that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. "Look at this," Marcus said, stopping at an overturned desk where papers were scattered across the floor. Even in the emergency lighting, Sarah could see enough to make her blood run cold. Facility names, dozens of them scattered across the United States. Project Blackwater in Nevada, Operation Silent Valley in Oregon, Compound Whisper in Alaska. Each file contained personnel lists, subject counts, and budget allocations that suggested a network of secret facilities that dwarfed anything she'd imagined. "They're not just operating here," Sarah realized. "This is happening everywhere." Marcus grabbed a handful of the documents. "We need to get these out. The public has to know." They reached the facility's main elevator, but the power failures had rendered it inoperable. The emergency stairs were their only option, and as they climbed, Sarah could hear the sounds of the facility's death throes below them, collapsing ceilings, exploding equipment, and the roar of fires that were consuming evidence of decades of atrocities. At the surface level, they emerged into Martha's basement to find it empty. The elderly secretary had apparently escaped, but she'd left behind more evidence in her haste. Filing cabinets full of recruitment records, payment vouchers, and most damning of all, correspondence with government agencies that revealed the scope of official involvement. Turdintrudon, the CIA, the Department of Defense, the Centers for Disease Control. Marcus read from one document. "This goes all the way to the top of the federal government." Outside, the mountain was lit by an orange glow as fires raged in the tunnels below. Sarah could see figures moving in the darkness. Danny and what appeared to be several other people, all working to spread the fires to every entrance of the underground complex. "He's not alone," she realized. "There are others." As they watched, one of the figures approached the house. In the flickering firelight, Sarah recognized Dorothy Mills, the elderly librarian who'd started Sarah's investigation by sharing her grandmother's secret records. "Dr. Chen," Dorothy called out, "we need to leave. Now. The main charges go off in 20 minutes. "Main charges?" "Danny's been preparing for this night for 53 years, Dorothy explained as they ran toward a waiting truck. "He didn't just plan to destroy the facility. He planned to bring down the entire mountain on top of it. No evidence, no chance of rebuilding, no possibility of covering this up again." In the truck, Sarah met the other members of Danny's group, descendants of the original miners, people who'd lost family members to Martha's recruitment schemes over the decades, and others who'd discovered pieces of the conspiracy and been quietly gathering evidence for years. "We call ourselves the Remembrance," one of them explained. "We've been documenting everything, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth." As they drove away from Copper Ridge, the mountain behind them erupted in a series of explosions that lit up the night sky like daylight. Danny's final revenge was complete. The facility, its records, and its ability to continue harming people were being erased forever. But even as Sarah felt satisfaction at seeing the destruction of such evil, she knew the fight was far from over. The documents they'd recovered revealed a network of similar facilities across the country. And Martha Whitfield was still alive, along with countless others who'd participated in or profited from decades of systematic murder. Dawn was breaking over the Appalachian Mountains as Sarah sat in the FBI field office in Charleston, West Virginia, surrounded by boxes of evidence that should have been enough to bring down a government conspiracy spanning 7 decades. But the reactions of the federal agents weren't what she'd expected. Special Agent Jennifer Morrison had been polite, professional, and completely unmoved by the mountain of documentation Sarah and Marcus had presented. The photographs, the recordings, the government correspondence, all of it was being cataloged with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd done this before. "Dr. Chen," Agent Morrison said, setting down the tape recorder that contained Esther Mills's 1951 recordings of government officials planning murder, "I want to assure you that we take these allegations very seriously." But her tone suggested otherwise. There was a practiced quality to her responses, as if she were following a script designed to placate whistleblowers while ensuring nothing came of their revelations. "These are serious federal crimes," Sarah insisted. "Hundreds of people have been murdered. There's an active conspiracy involving multiple government agencies. And we'll investigate every aspect of your claims," Morrison replied smoothly. "However, I need to inform you that much of this material appears to involve classified operations. National security considerations may limit how thoroughly we can pursue certain aspects of the investigation." Sarah felt her heart sink. The same national security justifications that had protected the original Operation Deep Strike were being deployed again, 53 years later. The federal government's response wasn't shock or outrage at the crimes committed in their name. It was damage control. Marcus, who'd been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "Agent Morrison, are you seriously suggesting that national security takes precedence over mass murder?" "I'm suggesting that these matters are complex," Morrison replied, "and that rushing to judgment based on incomplete information serves no one's interests." The dismissal was polite but absolute. Sarah realized with growing horror that they weren't being taken seriously as whistleblowers. They were being managed as a problem to be contained. "What about Martha Whitfield?" Sarah asked. "She's directly responsible for hundreds of deaths. Are you going to arrest her?" Morrison's expression didn't change. "Ms. Whitfield is currently being debriefed by appropriate agencies. Her cooperation in understanding the full scope of these alleged activities is valuable." Cooperation. They were treating a mass murderer as a valuable intelligence asset rather than a criminal who belonged in prison. The corruption ran deeper than Sarah had imagined. The meeting continued for another hour, with Morrison and her colleagues asking detailed questions about every aspect of Sarah's investigation while giving no indication that they intended to act on any of it. Finally, they were dismissed with assurances that they'd be contacted if their assistance was needed further. Outside the federal building, Sarah felt the weight of defeat settling on her shoulders. "They're going to bury this," she said to Marcus, "just like they buried it in 1951. "Maybe not entirely," Marcus replied, pulling out his phone. "While you were answering their questions, I was uploading copies of everything to a secure server. The Remembrance has contacts in investigative journalism. This story is going public whether the government likes it or not." That evening, in a safe house provided by Danny's network, Sarah watched as the first news reports began to break. The story was being covered, but not in the way she'd hoped. Instead of focusing on the decades of murder and human experimentation, the media was treating it as a historical curiosity, a Cold War-era incident with allegations of improper government oversight. The language was carefully sanitized, stripping away the human cost and reducing hundreds of murders to bureaucratic euphemisms. Worse, government spokespersons were already spinning the narrative, acknowledging irregularities in past operations while emphasizing that such practices do not reflect current federal policies. "They're controlling the story," Dorothy observed, joining Sarah in front of the television, making it sound like ancient history instead of ongoing crimes. The phone rang, and Danny answered it with a grim expression. After a brief conversation, he hung up and turned to the group with news that made Sarah's blood run cold. "That was one of our contacts in Oregon," he said. "The Blackwater facility we found documentation for. It suffered a gas leak explosion this morning. Complete destruction. No survivors. Same thing happened to the Alaska site 3 hours ago." The implications were staggering. The government wasn't just covering up the Copper Ridge facility. They were systematically destroying the entire network to prevent further investigation. The other sites that Sarah had hoped to expose were being eliminated, along with anyone who might have provided testimony about their operations. "How many people were in those facilities?" Marcus asked, though he clearly dreaded the answer. "We estimate between 50 and 100 at each site," Danny replied. "Researchers, technicians, security personnel, and an unknown number of test subjects." The scale of the cover-up was breathtaking. Rather than allow the truth to come to light, the government was committing fresh murders on a massive scale, ensuring that the evidence of their crimes died with the people who'd carried them out. 6 months after the destruction of the Copper Ridge facility, Sarah found herself in a television studio in Washington, D.C., facing a panel of journalists who seemed more interested in discrediting her story than investigating it. The segment was supposed to be an expose of government crimes, but it had become a trial of her credibility instead. "Dr. Chen," the host began, his tone suggesting skepticism, "you're asking the American people to believe that the federal government has been operating murder facilities for 70 years. Don't you think that sounds a bit conspiratorial?" Sarah had heard this question dozens of times over the past months. No matter how much evidence she presented, no matter how many documents she provided, the response was always the same. Polite dismissal wrapped in suggestions that she was either mistaken or mentally unstable. "I'm asking people to look at the evidence," she replied, gesturing to the stack of documents on the table beside her. "Government correspondence, financial records, facility blueprints, testimony from survivors. This isn't speculation. It's documentation." But she knew it wasn't working. The government's media strategy had been masterful, seeding doubt about every aspect of her story while never directly denying the core facts. They'd admitted to historical irregularities while painting her as an unstable scientist who'd misinterpreted routine Cold War research programs. Worse, Martha Whitfield had resurfaced, not as a fugitive mass murderer, but as a former government contractor who'd agreed to testify about improper oversight in historical research programs. Her testimony to Congress had been a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak, acknowledging problems while denying criminal intent. The allegations made by Dr. Chen, Martha had told the committee, her grandmother persona fully restored, reflect a misunderstanding of necessary but classified research that saved countless American lives during the Cold War. The hearing had been closed to the public. Martha's testimony sealed under national security classifications, but the carefully leaked summaries painted Sarah as a scientist who'd stumbled upon legitimate but secret government research and constructed elaborate conspiracy theories to explain what she didn't understand. After the television interview, Sarah sat in her hotel room, reading the latest news coverage on her laptop. The story was dying, relegated to conspiracy theory websites and fringe publications. Mainstream media had moved on to other scandals, other outrages that didn't threaten the fundamental structures of government power. Her phone rang. Danny's voice was tired when he answered, the weight of his 74 years finally showing. "Senator Meets. They got 3 more of our people," he said without preamble. "Car accidents, all of them. Single-vehicle crashes on remote mountain roads." Sarah felt the familiar chill of government intimidation. Over the past months, members of the Remembrance had been dying with suspicious regularity. Heart attacks, accidents, sudden illnesses, all affecting people who'd been preparing to come forward with testimony about the conspiracy. "We can't keep fighting this," Danny continued. "They have too many resources, too much power. We exposed one facility, but the network is too big. They'll just rebuild somewhere else." It was the first time Sarah had heard defeat in Danny's voice. The man who'd spent 53 years planning his revenge was finally acknowledging that some enemies were too powerful to overcome through individual action. "What about the families?" Sarah asked. "The people who still don't know what happened to their loved ones?" "We've done what we could," Danny replied. "We've documented the truth, even if the world isn't ready to hear it. Maybe someday, when the political climate changes, someone will be able to use what we've gathered." Sarah ended the call feeling hollow. They'd exposed a conspiracy that had murdered hundreds of people, destroyed evidence of government crimes spanning 7 decades, and rescued Marcus from certain death. But in the eyes of the public and the media, they'd accomplished nothing more than spreading unfounded conspiracy theories. The next morning brought news that felt like a final nail in the coffin of their investigation. The Washington Post ran a story about the Copper Ridge incident, describing it as a case study in how social media and internet conspiracy theories could transform routine government activities into elaborate fantasies of systematic murder. The article quoted psychiatric experts discussing the psychology of conspiracy theorists, government officials explaining the necessity of classified research programs, and local residents of Copper Ridge, who insisted that their town had never been the site of anything more sinister than ordinary coal mining. Sarah realized that they'd lost the media war completely. The truth had been buried under layers of official denials, expert opinions, and carefully constructed counter-narratives that made her look like a delusional scientist chasing shadows. 2 years after the destruction of the Copper Ridge facility, Sarah stood in a small cemetery outside Wheeling, West Virginia, placing flowers on a grave marked simply Daniel Henley, 1930-2007. Danny had died peacefully in his sleep, but Sarah knew the real cause of death was a broken heart. The weight of carrying the truth for 56 years, only to see it buried again by the same forces that had murdered his father. But Danny's death had galvanized the remaining members of the Remembrance. In his final months, he'd helped Sarah develop a strategy that government censorship couldn't touch. A distributed network of evidence that would survive even if all the witnesses died. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to convince mainstream media or government investigators, they would embed the truth into the permanent record through academic channels, legal filings, and historical archives that couldn't be easily suppressed or discredited. Marcus had returned to university teaching, but his geology classes now included detailed case studies of the Copper Ridge soil anomalies. Students learned to recognize the signatures of secret government mining operations while studying what appeared to be routine environmental science. Dorothy Mills had donated her grandmother's complete archives to 3 different universities, ensuring that Esther Mills's documentation of Operation Deep Strike would survive in academic collections that government agents couldn't simply make disappear. Most importantly, Sarah had written a book, not a sensational exposé that could be dismissed as conspiracy theory, but a meticulously documented academic work titled Environmental Forensics and Cold War Mining Operations in Appalachia. Published by a respected university press, it presented the Copper Ridge evidence as a case study in environmental investigation techniques. The book was boring, technical, and absolutely devastating to anyone who read it carefully. Buried in chapters about soil analysis and radiation detection were detailed descriptions of government murder programs, complete with photographs, documents, and witness testimony that painted an undeniable picture of systematic atrocities. The beauty of academic publishing, Sarah explained to Marcus as they reviewed the first edition, is that it's designed to preserve information forever. Government censors can suppress news stories and classified documents, but they can't make scholarly research disappear from library systems around the world. The strategy was working. Environmental science students at universities across the country were learning about Copper Ridge as a standard case study. Geology professors were using Martha Whitfield's recruitment methods as examples of how legitimate research could be corrupted by unethical practices. Most importantly, the families of the missing miners were finally learning the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. Sarah had tracked down descendants of the original victims, sharing copies of the evidence that proved their fathers and grandfathers had died as heroes, not deserters. "My grandfather didn't abandon us," said Maria Santos, whose grandfather had been among the 12 miners murdered in 1951. "He was murdered for trying to serve his country." The healing that came from knowledge was profound. For 7 decades, these families had lived with the shame of believing their loved ones had simply walked away. Learning the truth about their sacrifice transformed guilt into pride, abandonment into martyrdom. But Sarah knew that the larger network of facilities was still operating. Government black sites didn't simply disappear because one was exposed. They adapted, relocated, and continued their work with better security and more careful recruitment. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in November. The voice was young, nervous, and spoke in the careful code that members of the Remembrance had developed over the years. "Dr. Chen, my name is Jessica Walsh. I'm a graduate student in environmental science at Colorado State, and I've been reading your work on Appalachian mining operations. I think I've found something you'd be interested in." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of something?" "Soil anomalies near an abandoned mine in Montana, radiation signatures that match your Copper Ridge findings, and local stories about young people who disappear for work, opportunities that never seem to pan out." It was happening again. The network was still active, still recruiting, still murdering. But this time, they faced investigators who knew what to look for and how to document it in ways that couldn't be suppressed. "Send me everything you have," Sarah said, "and be careful. These people have been doing this for 70 years, and they don't hesitate to eliminate threats." "I understand," Jessica replied, "but I also understand that some truths are too important to ignore, no matter how dangerous they are to uncover." As Sarah prepared to begin another investigation, she thought about Danny Henley and the promise he'd made to his dying father. The truth would survive, no matter how many people tried to bury it. Each new discovery, each new witness, each new piece of evidence made the conspiracy harder to hide. 10 years had passed since Sarah first held that impossible soil sample in the autumn sunlight of Copper Ridge. Now, standing before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., she watched as Martha Whitfield was finally placed under oath. Not as a cooperative witness spinning bureaucratic fairy tales, but as a defendant facing charges of conspiracy to commit murder. The political climate had changed. A new generation of politicians, many of them educated by professors who'd used Sarah's academic work in their classes, had come to power with a mandate to investigate historical government crimes. The truth about Copper Ridge had finally found fertile ground in the halls of power. "Sahananerd." "Ms. Whitfield," the committee chair began, holding up a copy of Sarah's book. "Dr. Chen's research documents your direct involvement in the recruitment and murder of over 300 American citizens over a period of 50 years. How do you respond to these charges?" Martha, now 84 and frail, no longer maintained her grandmother persona. Her lawyer had advised her to invoke the Fifth Amendment, but the evidence was so overwhelming that even her silence was damning. The committee room was packed with families of the victims, not just from Copper Ridge, but from the 17 other facilities that Sarah's network of academic investigators had exposed over the past decade. Maria Santos sat in the front row, holding a photograph of the grandfather she'd never known, whose story had finally been told. "The evidence shows," the prosecutor continued, "that Operation Deep Strike was not an isolated Cold War incident, but the foundation of a program that continued for 7 decades, claiming hundreds of lives in service of illegal human experimentation." Sarah testified for 3 days, presenting a decade of research that had systematically mapped the government's network of murder facilities. Each site had been documented by a different academic team, creating a body of evidence that was impossible to dismiss as conspiracy theory. Marcus, now a department head at West Virginia University, had testified about the environmental forensics that revealed the true scope of the crimes. Dorothy Mills, despite her advanced age, had provided devastating testimony about her grandmother's documentation of the original cover-up. But it was Danny's recorded testimony, made in secret during his final months, that provided the most powerful moment of the hearings. His voice, weak but determined, filled the committee room as he described watching his father die from deliberate radiation poisoning in the tunnels beneath Copper Ridge. "I kept my promise," Danny's voice said from beyond the grave. "I never forgot what they did, and I never let anyone else forget either." The hearings concluded with Martha Whitfield's conviction on multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder. At 84, she would spend the rest of her life in federal prison, a fate that seemed insufficient punishment for decades of systematic murder, but represented the first time anyone had been held accountable for the conspiracy. More importantly, the hearings had triggered a broader investigation into government black sites and human experimentation programs. Congressional subcommittees were examining dozens of facilities, and victim compensation funds were being established for families who'd lost loved ones to government murder programs. But Sarah's greatest satisfaction came from a phone call she received on the anniversary of Danny's death. The voice was that of a young man, Danny's great-nephew, who'd grown up never knowing his family's history. "Dr. Chen," he said, "I wanted to thank you for giving us back our story. For 56 years, my family thought we were descendants of a coward who abandoned his community. Now we know we're descendants of a hero who died serving his country and a son who spent his life seeking justice." The healing that came from truth was perhaps the most important outcome of the entire investigation. Families who'd lived with shame and abandonment for generations finally understood that their loved ones had been victims, not deserters. Sarah's academic network had grown into a formal organization, the Institute for Historical Accountability, that investigated government crimes and ensured that evidence survived. Official attempts at suppression. Young researchers around the world were applying her methods to uncover other conspiracies, other cover-ups, other attempts to bury inconvenient truths. As she walked out of the congressional hearing room, Sarah thought about the impossible soil sample that had started it all. One anomalous reading in a routine environmental survey had unraveled a conspiracy that spanned 7 decades and claimed hundreds of lives. The government agents who'd designed Operation Deep Strike had believed they could commit murder with impunity, protected by classification levels and national security justifications. They'd never imagined that their crimes would be exposed by a scientist with a Geiger counter and an unwillingness to accept simple explanations for complex problems. Standing on the steps of the Capitol, surrounded by families who finally knew the truth about their missing loved ones, Sarah realized that the real secret of Copper Ridge hadn't been what the government buried in those tunnels. It had been the simple fact that truth, once uncovered, is impossible to bury forever. The miners of 1951 had finally received the recognition they deserved. Their families had found peace, and the conspiracy that murdered them had been exposed for all the world to see. In small towns across America, similar stories were waiting to be uncovered. But now, there was a network of people trained to recognize the signs, equipped to gather the evidence, and determined to ensure that no more secrets would be buried in unmarked graves. The truth had survived, and it would continue to survive. One investigation at a time, one family at a time, one impossible soil sample at a time.